guys. Today we're going to be continuing Chapter 4. Just a reminder, guys, that your stock portfolios are going to be due on the 9th. So we're playing the stock market till the 31st. One of the biggest mistakes people make. Actually, here are the ways people make mistakes in the stock game. Number one, they put it off to the last minute. They just do not get in with it. They put it off to the last minute. They're scrambling the weekend before to be able to get it together. The other ways they make mistakes, they don't distribute the work equally. The biggest single way that people screw up is by plagiarizing. So please, if you have a question whether or not something is plagiarism, come and see me. I'll set you straight. And of course, today is St. Patrick's Day, so we are wearing our green. If you are wearing green or a Hawaiian shirt and you did not sign up here for your bonus point or points, please come up and do so. Just a reminder, I'm going to be checking in with Career Services on Monday about Handshake. If you set your profiles up, you get an easy 10 points. If you have not yet, you'll get a reminder from me to please set it up. But because it's St. Patrick's Day, we're going to be talking a little bit about something that's in the news these days, and it's some stuff that's going on with Ireland. Guys, we have two countries right beside each other. We've got Ireland and Northern Ireland. And this was associated with a very problematic time in the history of Europe. Does anybody know what was the problem between Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland? See if you know your American or your world history. Anybody know what happened between these two countries? I'm going to give you some history here. This part of Ireland, Northern Ireland, is controlled by the UK. It's owned by England. The rest of Ireland is an independent country. Well, most of the people who live in this region are Protestants. Most of the people who live in this region were Catholics. And in the 70s, they had problems between the two countries. They called them the Troubles. And has anybody ever heard of a group called the IRA? The Irish Republican Army. And they basically were insurgents in Northern Ireland trying to blow up people and cause problems with the peace process. All of this bad blood between Catholics and Protestants resulted in something called the Good Friday Accord, which meant there was peace between Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland. And as such, there is free trade flowing back and forth. Here's where it gets complicated. We're going to watch a video that explains this better than I am. Because Northern Ireland is part of the UK. What did England just leave? They just left the EU. So now we've got this scenario where we've got part of the country, the continent, I should say, or the landmass, Ireland, is still in the EU. Northern Ireland is not. So in essence, we're talking about now complications in free trade between people who all, at some level, consider themselves citizens of the same island of Ireland. This is a very complicated situation. I'm going to play a video for you that kind of outlines what's going on here because it ties into things we're talking about in terms of global politics, professor. I'm not a history professor. I'm not the person you want doing your analysis of global events, but we're going to try to make this make sense. So we've got England, the UK, which pulled out of the European Union. Does anybody know, by the way, why so many people in England wanted to pull out of the EU in the first place? Why did they want out?
Weren't they the ones contributing the most to financially?
You pay a penalty, you pay a tax to be a part of the EU. So what these folks are basically saying, what are we getting out of all this money we're paying for administration? And it was a very nationalistic stance. We said basically, we're pulling out of this. We still want to do trade with you, Europe, but we don't want to have to pay to do it. So then we've got two layers of complications going on top of this. We've got Northern Ireland, which is technically part of the UK, but they're still staying in the EU in a cursory way. They're part of the UK, but they've got a separate deal with the rest of the European Union so they can continue to enjoy friction-free trade. And then we've got the Republic of Ireland, which is a full member of the EU. And we've got Great Britain, who's basically saying this is part of us. And so they've got some exceptions now to still, in the transition period, bring goods and services into Northern Ireland without being subject to the rules and the taxation of the EU. What this creates is a very complicated situation. So if you're going from England over to Northern Ireland, at this point in time, you can still go through the ports and have relatively low barriers to entry. You can take your goods and services in, and from that point, they can go over the border from Northern Ireland into the Republic of Ireland because they've got a semi-open border, sort of like we normally have with Canada and Mexico, probably even more so because they view themselves as citizens of the same country. So that's complicated on one aspect. If Ireland wants to ship stuff to Great Britain, they have to go through normal EU rules, the Republic of Ireland. Same with Northern Ireland. So coming in is different than going out. On top of this, what all of this is doing is aggravating what we refer to as a very delicate balance of power between Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland because of the peace accord that was signed in the late 90s, because of the violent war that they had going on for 20 years. Literally thousands of people died in this war. And right now, if we start putting barriers between these two countries to trade, that can aggravate the old tensions because people are going to be asking who's getting the best deal. So this is an example, guys, of how something as simple as saying, hey, we're England, we want to leave the EU, when it comes right down to it, is not as simple as they wish it were. Now, here's what's interesting. If you get into the UK's relationship with the EU is they can export pretty easily to the rest of the EU. The tougher part is bringing products in because there's all kinds of paperwork required now because people on both sides don't want to make it too easy. Crazy situation and something we're going to wait to see how it gets resolved. If I were a betting man, and I was going to say, how is this going to get resolved? I would say the people in Ireland and the UK are going to move heaven and earth to try to keep this border open because there are people who still remember how bad it was during the Troubles. So this is the intersection between commerce and politics, guys. Any thoughts? I mean, here's the way to think about it. When we talk about the Civil War in the United States, what was the dividing line between the North and the South? It's the Mason-Dixon line. And so that was when you crossed the Mason-Dixon, you knew you were heading into the the southern states. Well, that line between Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland is sort of like their Mason-Dixon line. And if we restarted the Civil War, things could get bad for us. That's the kind of stuff these folks are living with, except there are lots of people alive who still remember what happened. Any thoughts, guys? Kind of crazy in this period of Easter when we're talking about the idea of sacrifice and redemption and all these sorts of things. We got to keep the people of Northern Ireland and Ireland in our thoughts. So hopefully they figure this out in a peaceable way. It's scary that people are forgetting that peace accord. But we left off talking, guys, about different ways we could start businesses. Let's do a little review, shall we? What is one advantage? We're going to start on this side of the room today. What is one advantage to a sole proprietorship? You start a business yourself. What's one advantage? Yes?
Make your own choice.
You can make your own choices. And you're making your own choices. What else can you make? You can make your own decisions, and it's green. What am I talking about? You can keep all the money. Absolutely right. Now, what's a disadvantage this side of the room to a sole proprietorship? We know that there's an advantage. What's a disadvantage? There's a lot of work. You got one person doing the job. Is there another disadvantage? Yes?
There's more risk.
There's lots of risk because if you fail, who's backing you up? Nobody's backing you up. So it's all stuff we got to think about here. We get into partnerships, we have some advantages too. We'll start over here for this one. What's an advantage of a partnership? What's a good idea? Why is it a good idea to have a partner? Yes?
Share the workload.
You can share the workload. What else can we share, guys? Different viewpoints, ideas. We have all that stuff that's great. What's a disadvantage on this side to a partnership? What would be a disadvantage, guys? Think about controlling the TV in a marriage. By the way, that's one of the biggest things you'll find about when you get married, is what you watch at night. So what's a disadvantage to a partnership, guys? What's a disadvantage? We don't get along, absolutely correct. We have a sincerity of vision. Are we seeing eye to eye? And it's hard to split up. Marriages are hard to split up too. It costs money and it can be difficult. Well, then we get into the third range of things, which is called a corporation. A corporation exists to live beyond the life of the people who started it. So we have state laws that can control corporations, meaning you got to incorporate in whatever state that you're in. A corporation itself can act like a person. It can own property, it can make contracts, and it can be sued. Now, the wonderful part about working for a corporation, if your corporation collectively does something dumb, and the corporation gets sued, usually the individual people in the corporation don't get sued. For example, when Volkswagen did their whole diesel scandal, now a couple of folks there did go to jail. But the average person working in a Volkswagen factory didn't go to jail because somebody in management made a bad decision. You've got life and accountability somewhat separate from the people who actually own the company. So let's say, for example, we decided we wanted to form a corporation. It ain't hard in the United States. It costs you a couple of bucks, but it's not hard, guys. Pick a name. So we're going to be, I don't know, Tom Corp. I think that's got a great ring to it. Or maybe Patrick Corp. Or Kent Patrick Tompkins Corp. Whatever we want to do. We follow what we call the Articles of Incorporation. All that means is we're putting on paper someplace, what are we about? What are we here to do? What is the purpose of our company? And then we create what we refer to as a board of directors. Your board of directors, especially in a publicly traded company, makes decisions. You guys remember, we talked about stocks. The biggest disadvantage to a company of issuing stock is what? What's the biggest disadvantage? If you issue stock in your company, what are you giving away? You're giving away control. Absolutely correct. And your board of directors are the people who are going to make decisions for your corporation. Guess what? If your shareholders aren't happy, those are the folks who probably are losing their jobs. And then you also have to create bylaws. For example, you got to pay a couple of fees to incorporate too with the government. You got to have bylaws, and your group has to meet and keep notes of your meetings. So you're basically saying, how are we setting this whole thing up? So again, the Articles of Incorporation detail what your company is about, what your name is. Are you selling private stock, or are you going to keep it internal? And we're going to talk about the different ways you can do that. If you want to own stock in this company, what's it going to cost if you're not publicly traded? Where are you going to be located? By the way, plenty of companies that operate in the United States try to incorporate. They try to incorporate outside of the United States. Anybody know why? You go to places like the Cayman Islands or Ireland, for example. Anybody know why? Why would you incorporate outside of the United States? Any guesses? Yes?
Don't pay U.S. taxes.
You're not paying U.S. taxes. We call them tax shelters. There's plenty of people, for example, who back in the day would set up a company where literally it'd be a phone. It would be a phone located in the Cayman Islands. If you called their office, they might have one employee who would answer the phone. You could say we're incorporated in the Cayman Islands. Well, how come you're not paying U.S. taxes? Well, we're not based in the United States. And one of the biggest countries, guys, because we're wearing green today, for U.S. tax shelters is Ireland. Apple does a blank pile of business in Ireland because they have such competitive global tax rates. The United States, although under the last presidential administration we cut corporate tax rates a lot, we're still not the most competitive country in the world for business based on taxes. So how does this work, guys, in terms of corporate governance? Guys, you got the stockholders. And again, if you've got two potential kinds of stock. You've got preferred and you've got common. Which gives you voting rights? Common stock. Absolutely correct. Common stock gives you voting rights. For every share of stock, of common stock you have, you got to vote. Well, these folks elect directors to the company, and these folks hire the folks who actually run the company. Now, sometimes the chairman of the board, for example, of the board for the company, might also be the president of the company. You can do both. Those folks ultimately are picking who is running your company. So your board in a corporation, especially one that uses stock or has public stock, is controlled by its directors who select who is going to make the company run. So you're going to get to vote. This is funny, guys. Before we get to the next slide, anybody remember, I'm always talking about my favorite stock, the one I've actually made some dividends on. Anybody remember what stock I love? Planet Fitness. I think in the last year, because I own 2 shares of stock, literally, I own 2 shares of Planet Fitness. I always want to go into my local Planet Fitness and ask them to give me a tour. You know, like, hey, bring my stocks into the because I like to see how my investment is doing, you know? Do you know what Gerard, you know how much money I made last year on Planet Fitness? Anybody remember I told you guys how much money I made? How much was it? I made $1.50 in dividends because they're paying me 19-cent dividends. Now my stock is appreciated. I wish I had bought more. But the bottom line is I want to go in and actually file a vote because every year in the mail I get my certificate to be able to vote for the board of directors with my 2 shares of stock. So if I wanted to, I could vote. What would my vote mean? As the old expression is, somewhere between jack and shit. That's what my vote would probably mean, but I could vote if I wanted to. But anyway, so let's say we're setting up a corporation. Remember this. The typical type of corporation is what we refer to as a C Corp. And the C stands for conventional. So if you go to Apple, if you go to Tesla, if you go to most of the major big companies we're talking about, they are C Corps. And they're oftentimes on an exchange or publicly traded. So if you say we need to have a big company, we're going for a C Corp. Ford Motor Company, C Corp. General Motors, C Corp. Boeing, C Corp. That is a typical big corporation. The biggest advantage is it can be big. It can have perpetual life. The disadvantage is it's big and tough to manage. It can be really tough to change. I'm going to talk about that in a minute in terms of why some of the big companies have not been good in the 21st century. Then we get to an S Corp. Now, an S Corp means we're going to have a small corporation. Now, it is an interesting scenario. So if you're going to be a medium-sized company, you might want to be an S Corp. An S Corp can have no more than 100 shares of stock, or not shares of stock, 100 shareholders, I should say. It's taxed like a partnership, which is at a lower rate than a C Corp. A C Corp has the highest rate of taxation. And this way, because you're taxed like a partnership, if you're making profits, you are not getting taxed twice. Now, there are other things that go into an S Corp. For example, an S Corp, everybody who's in the S Corp has to be a U.S. citizen. That's part of the rules of an S Corp in the United States. But it is a very advantageous place to be for medium-sized companies. And then you can also be a limited liability company or a limited liability corporation. And that means that you can decide that you want to be taxed like a partnership or a corporation. Here's one of the other advantages. If I'm Kent Tonkin, the consultant, I'm Kent Tonkin just working as a sole proprietor, or if I make myself an LLC, what's the difference? The difference is if I screw up as a sole proprietor, the bank can come after my house, the bank can come after my cars, the bank can even garnish my wages. If I am an LLC over here, I separate myself and my personal assets from the business. It takes a little bit more money and a little bit more time to set up as an LLC. But if you want to know, for example, why some guys who own their own trucks, like shipping companies, establish themselves as an LLC, that's why. And the thing is, too, there's actually some big companies that also establish themselves as LLC. Correct me if I'm wrong on this, but at this point, the Chrysler company, I'm trying to remember what Fiat Chrysler Group is now an LLC. They're not even publicly traded anymore. So what are the advantages to corporations in general? And this applies pretty much to all of them. You take some limitation on liability. You're taking the responsibility off all the individuals. That's part of it. You also can transfer ownership. If you're transferring ownership in your publicly traded company, that's easy. It's who's buying your stock, for example. Corporations can exist for a long time. If you're the Ford Motor Company, you've been around for over 100 years. Guys, think about that. How many brands can you think of that have been around for 100 years? Well, you got Ford, you got General Motors, General Electric. It's tough to think of brands that have been around that long. By the way, here's a brand. Whenever, let's see if somebody left me a marker. If not, if I can't draw it for you, I'll just describe it to you. Guys, when you see that yellow oval for Batman, because you guys know I'm a big Batman fan, obviously. Does anybody here know how old that brand is? 82. Batman's been around since 1939. So we're talking like 81, 82 years old. One of the most globally recognizable brands because he is intellectual property of a corporation that's been perpetual. You get tax deductions depending on your scenario, although if you're a C Corp, you still get taxed twice. And if you're a big corporation, sometimes it's easier to get people to want to invest because you have a better chance at making it. What are some of the disadvantages? If you're in a C Corp, for example, you're going to get double taxation. Remember, in S Corp, you can choose how you want to be taxed. It can be complicated to form a corporation, and there's a lot more restrictions in terms of what you can and can't do because you're in the public eye, particularly if you're publicly traded. We're going to take a minute to compare the three types of corporations and go through a little bit of an impromptu evaluation of these, and then we're going to take our first break. So let's compare these, guys. A C Corp, you're going to pay the most taxes because you're generally the biggest company. The stock, basically, if you're publicly traded, for example, you have separate liability from the shareholders. If somebody is doing bad trading out in the public, if they're trading your shares of stock and being dishonest, that doesn't come back on you as the company. And the people who work for the company also don't have the same liability as the company as a whole. If you want to talk about profit, generally speaking, C Corps have the highest possibility for profit out of all of them. So if I ask you guys, which corporation type is the one with the largest potential to make big bucks, you would answer, you'd answer C. And C is always the right answer when you don't know the answer. All right, if you're an S Corp, again, the thing to remember, no more than 100 shareholders. And you got to be U.S. citizens, although I never asked you a question on that one. Basically, at this point, you can choose how you want to be taxed. You can be taxed as a partnership, or you can be taxed as a corporation. In which case you pay twice. Generally speaking, most people choose to be taxed as personal income. And again, your potential for profit means if I own 60% of the stocks, I make 60% of the profits. And LLCs, you can also choose how you want to be taxed. The biggest reason that LLCs are formed, number one, you want to separate yourself from the risk, and the other part of it too, in an LLC, there's no publicly traded stock. It all has to be controlled internally. With me so far, guys? Are you with me so far? All right. How many of you guys, by the way, when you're kids, like cereal? Anybody like Lucky Charms? Can anybody name all the marshmallows in Lucky Charms? I wonder if I could. You got what? Yellow moons, green clovers, blue stars, purple horseshoes. Did they put rainbows in there too at some point? Yeah. Well, somebody look that up. I'm curious. What are all the marshmallows in Lucky Charms? That would be a really good bonus question. What are all the marshmallows in Lucky Charms? Who can tell me? Who can tell me how many marshmallows in Lucky Charms? The first one to tell me. How many we got, guys? We got some folks on their computers. How many Lucky Charms do we got? What do we got? Somebody has to be looking that up. Pretty please. All these devices. Somebody. Yes, ma'am.
Did you say how many or what are they?
What are they?
Hearts, stars, horseshoes, clovers, red balloons, hourglasses, rainbows, and 6 new swirl moons.
Holy crap, they've added more marshmallows since the last time I ate Lucky Charms. I remember at one point in time you could buy a whole box of just the marshmallows. Wouldn't that have been heaven when you were a kid? Don't give me the oat cereal, just give me the bad stuff that makes the milk change color. So anyway, guys, that's our breakout there, but that's gonna be a bonus question. We're gonna see how many of the Lucky Charms marshmallows you can name. But right now, I need to know, what kind of corporation do you think we should have? We got a biotech firm that might have a cure for AIDS, or it could put a preventative cure for COVID at this point in time. It would be just as interesting to people. And it's a large cash startup. We got hundreds of employees. What type of corporation do we want? High potential for profit and getting big, maybe even public stock. I'd go for a C Corp too, absolutely. Here we go. We've got a small investment firm, and we have no interest in going public. We're still deciding, however, how we want to be taxed. You can you could go either way. You could be an S Corp, or you could be an LLC on this one, depending on how small you wanted to say. If you answered S Corp, I'd say correct. If you said LLC, I'd say correct as well. Oh, we want to keep this corporation limited to 100 shareholders, maybe a family business. What kind of corp do we want? S. Yeah, absolutely correct. We want to keep it at an S Corp. You got it. So, guys, I'm going to pause before we continue for our first question of the day, because I feel like the luck of the Irish is upon us. By the way, has anybody here ever heard of the Blarney Stone? What's the Blarney Stone all about?
It's a stone in a castle in Ireland that kiss.
People bend down and kiss the Blarney Stone for good luck. Here's something you may not know. We got a piece of the Blarney Stone in the library. If you go to the library today, you ask them, they might show it to you. They probably won't let you kiss it because it's COVID and that. But you know what I'm talking about. It's COVID and that. Go over there and try to kiss that thing, and people are going to think you're ignorant. But we're going to ask for our first question of the day. Who here has a question or comment today? Who? Yes, ma'am. Will you raise your hand? I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am. What's that? I have. I've got several. Have you? Did they bring you good luck? You know, we got to think about what we're lucky for in life. I know what I'm lucky for in life. I'm lucky that I get to do this job because I love my job, and I'm lucky I have a wife who puts up with my nonsense. Think about what you're lucky for today, because after all, it is St. Patrick's Day. That was an excellent question. One more question before we continue, because I'm gonna hit warp speed for the next part of this lecture because I'm feeling fired up today. So we need one more question before I launch into my next tirade. What's it going to be? Who here has a question or comment? About anything. Well, here's a question for you guys then. Who among you, because it's St. Patrick's Day, can name either an Irish actor or an Irish musician? Ewan McGregor, is he? I think he's Scottish.
Try.
I think he's Scottish, but I could be wrong. Ewan McGregor, though. Look it up. Who else? Biggest rock band in the world. Still, even though they're classic rock. Bono and U2. Right from Ireland. So, anyway, since there's no questions, we're going to continue, guys. We talked about what the advantages of sole proprietorships and partnerships are. Well, the advantages of corporations, again, separation from the individual liability, the ability to be perpetual, to make profit, to avoid having to have individual liability. The biggest disadvantages to corporations are that they're complex and sometimes slow to respond. I'll give you an example. General Motors, back in the day, I think it was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, although I could be wrong. I'm often wrong. I've been wrong before. I'll be wrong again. He used to say, because General Motors was so honking big, that what was good for General Motors was good for the United States. What did he mean by that, by the way? What did FDR mean when he said what's good for GM is good for the U.S.? What could that possibly have meant? It was a big-ass company. So what was good for GM is good for the U.S. What did he mean by that? Exactly right. GM was a good barometer for the economy. And for a time, General Motors was the largest automaker in the world. Well, check this out, guys. In the early 2000s, we had a little problem with GM. If you drove a Chevy Cobalt or a bunch of other cars, what happened was the ignition would stick. You would be in traffic, and all of a sudden, for no good reason at all, your car would just shut off. Well, people died, about 300 or 400 people, I think it was. No, I have that decimal wrong. 30 or 40 died because their car shut off in the middle of bad traffic, and all of a sudden they're getting hit by other people because they can no longer control their cars. That's terrible, but mistakes happen. However, in General Motors, why did that mistake happen? Because people knew about that mistake for about 10 years, and the part to fix it would have cost about 50 cents. Why didn't it get fixed? Because the corporate culture and the slowness to respond in that company was so entrenched that nobody ever got the memo. It never got fixed. That's a disadvantage of traditional corporations. They can be very slow to respond. Then we get into something called a cooperative. Now, cooperatives are a little different. They're not really corporations, but they are what the word says they are. They're ways we can cooperate. A great example, for example, with power companies. There are people in this region who don't have Penelec. They've got what we call REA, and that's a power cooperative. And what that means is every month when you pay your bill, you also are paying sort of a subscription fee that you partially own the company. There's a place locally called Our Building Center that says we care because we own it, because people are cooperatives in there as well. If you go to an Ace Hardware, for example, Ace Hardwares are not franchises. They are cooperatives. If you're a local independent hardware store, you can choose to be an Ace cooperative. And what that means is Ace, as a separate company, buys in bulk, and you can get things like rakes and bolts and things that hardware stores sell and compete with the big companies a little better than you would be on your own. So that's an example of a buyer cooperative. Then we have what we refer to as seller cooperatives, and that means, for example, we go through distributors. If we're a bunch of produce producers, for example, Sunkist, as a seller cooperative, takes oranges from multiple people and sells them under the Sunkist label. So that would be an example of a seller cooperative. So buyer cooperatives, Ace. Local hardware stores get to compete. Seller cooperatives, all the orange growers go to Sunkist and sell their products. It's kind of like a corporation, but it's not taxed like one. So let's keep going. We're going to move a little bit today. Then we get into franchises. And obviously we talk a lot about franchises. The person who sells the system, the person who says, hey, why don't you come on board with me? That's the franchisor. And then you've got the franchisee, and that's the person who buys in. What's the biggest franchise in the United States? I'm thinking fast food. What am I thinking of? McDonald's, still the king. And by the way, has anybody tried the new chicken sandwich yet? The rumor is that it's pretty darn good. So I want to try one of those one of these days. But franchisees and franchisors have a mutually beneficial relationship. It's a great way to get into business, for example. If you want to go in terms of initial investment, this is again out of our text, and an entrepreneur basically said 7-Eleven was on the top. I don't see it. I know that they're saying that basically the initial investment is anywhere between $37,000 and $1.6 million. I see more McDonald's around the country than I see 7-Eleven, so I'm not sure about entrepreneurs' categories here. If you answered McDonald's, if you answered Dunkin', if you answered any of these brands being in the top 10, I would give you credit for it. But the bottom line is we got a lot of franchises here that are getting into all kinds of things. Now, we also get into service industries. For example, there's a group called Visiting Angels, and that's if you want to get into, for example, taking care of older people, you can become a Visiting Angels franchisee franchisee and take care of people in their homes. Maid services, all of these kinds of things, hardware services, handyman services. There are all kinds of ways to get into business, guys. And again, what are some of the advantages? If you get into, actually, let me ask you guys. We always talk about Ken Tompkins Chicken Shack versus Chick-fil-A. What's the advantage to going with Chick-fil-A? Other than the fact their sandwiches are better. What is the biggest advantage? Brand recognition, absolutely. Does Chick-fil-A have an established way they do supply chain? Yeah, absolutely. They have distribution, they've got supply chain, they've got marketing, they've got a plan for just about everything. They also will train you. By the way, guys, does anybody know anybody who owns a Chick-fil-A? Well, I do. The guy in Altoona, his name is Mike Bergmeyer. His sister works for the School of Business here. Mike Bergmeyer had to go away for 3 months of training to get to run a Chick-fil-A. I mean, they literally train you in their entire philosophy. So by the time he came with boots on the ground, ready to start his business, there was no question how he was going to run his business because it was provided. A lot of these groups will even help you get low-cost financing to be able to get in. Now, the disadvantage of having a franchise is you don't control your product. There's no way if you're a Chick-fil-A franchisee, you're going to say, hey, you know what? I got this great idea. Why don't we start selling fish during Lent? That might be a great idea, especially in highly Catholic areas, but it's not going to happen unless you go through corporate. They control that stuff. It's harder to get in because you've got to do a big initial investment, and the creativity cannot happen. By the way, guys, I did mention that somebody earlier was an entrepreneur from McDonald's. What sandwich got created by an entrepreneur? Big Mac. Remember what he got for it? He got a plaque, man. Most iconic sandwich in all of fast food history. What did we pay him with? We paid him with a plaque. Man. And I don't even know at this point in time if McDonald's would allow that kind of creativity because they are so entrenched in what they're doing. Let's keep going, guys. In terms of things to think about in terms of whether or not you want to purchase a franchise, you got to think, number one, do you have what it takes in terms of tenacity? It can be hard. It's hard to find the location. It's hard to find the land. It's hard to get approved. Guys, Five Guys, for example. How many of you guys like Five Guys burgers? Oh, I'm craving one of those today. But Five Guys, they have a very strict metric. They will not open stores within so many miles of each other because they want to ensure that it's a thing to go to a Five Guys. Chick-fil-A does the same thing. Who does not? What franchises do you seem to see everywhere? Sheetz and Sheetz is privately held, so they're not a franchise, but you're right. We have sometimes several Sheetz in the same block. 7-Elevens are everywhere. Absolutely. Two more. McDonald's. Like, they'll put them like 2 streets across from each other. One more. Eat Fresh, what am I talking about? There's a freaking Subway everywhere at this point in time. You know, but those companies, by the way, in the long term, sometimes lose quality and value by doing that. So you have to decide if you've got what it takes to work within those constructs and be able to make a go of it. This is what's crazy, guys. When Chick-fil-A first opened in Altoona, Pennsylvania, it was the 1990s, and they opened in a food court in the old Logan Valley Mall, which is rapidly becoming a ghost town. But at that point, it was a complete failure. They lasted 1.5 years. Why? Well, because nobody up here in this part of the country knew what the heck Chick-fil-A was. They had to be more successful other places before people started really giving them a chance. So sometimes timing is everything. So franchises, guys, are being driven by all kinds of people. Baby boomers, people who are older, are starting to drive franchises, and on both sides of it, guys. When we think about it, we're aging. This country is getting older all the time. People, the birth rates are not as high, so as a result, we got birth rates that are declining, and we got older people that are living longer. What does that mean? We got a country that's full of older people, guys. And what that means is, as you're living longer, things like home instead can be really valuable franchises. The flip side is, A lot of older folks are saying, you know what? Let's keep starting businesses. Why not? Why don't we start our own franchise? And then we've also got millennials, and millennials, people who are just entering their 30s right now, they want more flexible work schedules. So they might do a work-at-home franchise. They might do something like home instead, where they can set their own hours, for example. Next, we're going to be getting into mergers and acquisitions. I'm going to cover that. Actually, yeah, I'm going to cover that today. We'll get through that. I need to pause for 1 second, however. Here's a question for you guys. How many of you have ever had a shamrock shake? What is your opinion of the shamrock shake? How many of you like the shamrock shake? How many of you think it's disgusting? Oh, I'm in the minority. I just can't get into the shamrock shake. I made the mistake last week, I think I shared this with you, Will, of buying a beer called Leprechauns Love Milkshakes 2. And it was a mint-flavored beer. And it might have been the most disgusting thing ever. There's a company out of Pennsylvania. This company is called New Trail Brewing, and they will do anything. In fact, over Valentine's Day, you remember candy hearts? You know, I'm talking about sweethearts, the little mints. They made beer with sweethearts in it. And it's as bad as you think it was. It was like, their normal beers are amazing. This was kind of like drinking chalk, like mint-flavored chalk. And I don't know why I did it. It was kind of like when you were a kid. You could admit this. How many of you ever stuck your finger in a fan? When the fan was going, we've all done it. We've all done it. That is the palate equivalent of sticking your finger in a fan. Is drinking a beer that has candy hearts in it. Don't do it. I've done it for you. You don't have to. So that being said, guys, let's get into mergers and acquisitions. If we're talking about mergers, we're talking about two companies coming together. We're talking about acquisitions. We're talking about a big fish eating a little fish. Let's talk about power, guys. First of all, why do mergers and acquisitions happen? Anybody know? Why do companies come together, or why do companies buy other companies? What might be a reason? Anybody know? Why might you buy another company? Yes.
You like what they're doing, but you think you can provide them maybe a bigger market, or they're failing and you can help support them.
We like your intellectual property, but we want it for ourselves. So we could want to expand our offerings. Is there another reason you might buy a company? What might be another reason?
We might be competing with each other.
We're going to buy our competitor out. We're going to take them over. Absolutely. How many of you guys are Nike fans? How many of you guys? I like Nike too. How many of you are Converse fans? Like Converse Chucks? Well, you guys know who owns Converse? Nike. Nike bought them because it was a product that they liked. The company Converse was struggling. Nike got them for a steal, and they made the company better, but they got all their intellectual property. When you have a merger, when you have two companies that are coming together, it can be very messy and very ugly because it comes down to who is going to be the dominant force. When you have an acquisition, it's a little more straightforward. For example, if you've got a big company like Nike swallowing up a small company like Converse, who's going to have more power in that scenario? The swoosh, for sure. So when you get into a merger, what happens, guys, is we look at redundancy. Well, okay, here we are. Let's say we're two equal companies here. Let's say, for example, we are Mazda and we are Mitsubishi. We're both middle-of-the-road size automakers in the United States. So we've got Mazda and Mitsubishi. What might we have that's redundant between these two companies? We know we have two different kinds of cars. But do we really need two payroll departments? No, probably not. Do we need two HR departments? No, probably not there either. Do we need two systems of anything? Probably not. So generally speaking, when there is a merger and acquisition, people lose their jobs. That's just part of the deal, and somebody's corporate culture either takes over or it doesn't. Sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. We're going to talk about some unsuccessful ones, but we're going to talk about the types of mergers first. A horizontal merger means you get two companies. Again, we're talking Mazda and we're talking Mitsubishi. If they're at a similar level of development, they come together, that's a horizontal merger. A vertical merger means that we're acquiring something to get intellectual property. So, for example, YouTube used to be its own company, and Google bought YouTube because they very much wanted their capability. If we get conglomerate mergers, that means we get companies that are completely unrelated industries that end up coming together or being purchased. And then we have what we call leverage buyouts, which means you try to aggressively take over another company. Now, let's talk about conglomerates for a second. Actually, we're going to talk about conglomerates and briefly about Daimler Chrysler. Conglomerates, guys, we got this company, Altria, that's actually used to be, I believe, Philip Morris. They make cigarettes. Well, they also own these companies, guys. A cigarette company owns Miller Brewing. They own Kraft. What's Kraft's most famous product? Mac and cheese. You got it. And Nabisco, cookies. If you're a cigarette company, what the blank are you doing buying these kinds of companies? What do you think? How many of you in this room think that cigarette companies, that selling cigarettes has a bright future in the United States? Absolutely correct. Because what we're talking about here is that, hey, we realize as an industry, our days are numbered. We better diversify. We better get into other businesses because sooner or later, even the dumbest among us will no longer smoke. And so it comes down to, by the way, I hope so much none of you guys ever smoke. It's terrible. It's so bad for you. In my generation, people thought it was cool. It's terrible. But conglomerates work out sometimes, and sometimes they don't. Guys, in terms of a horizontal merger that did not work out, in the 1980s, the late 1980s, Daimler-Benz was a large German automobile company. When I say Benz, what am I talking about? What car company am I talking about? Mercedes. When you think the term Mercedes, what are adjectives that you think about? Luxury. What else? Expensive. Well-made. Performance. Things that are status symbols. I get charged to think about it. When we think about Dodge, what do we think about? What comes to mind when you say Dodge? Minivan. Yeah, we're thinking about minivans. Maybe trucks. Maybe neons. Maybe even a Chrysler Sebring. So are those two brands compatible? No, it was terrible. It didn't work because the German culture of perfection came into Detroit and basically said, you got to step this up a little bit. And what the folks in Detroit were basically, they were doing, the George Bush thing and saying, we don't need to because our audience doesn't care about that stuff. And that's why that merger was not successful. It didn't work out in the long run because the average minivan buyer had different priorities than the person driving a Benz. And the average person driving a Benz expected a higher level of quality than the average Chrysler minivan driver. By the way, last question for you guys today. How many of you at some point in your lives had a minivan in your family? They were like the classic American station wagon. And if you had wood grade on them, you experienced something few people have. Guys, have a wonderful day. Happy St. Patrick's Day.